Our passage today is really challenging to us Christians and how we live the Christian life, because today we are presented with Jesus' teachings on his life's mission and then his expectations of humility, service, and self-sacrifice for his disciples. And we see that in the context of a conversation with the apostles here. As you read through the Gospels, commentators and theologians largely agree that each one of the four Gospels seem to emphasize something different about Jesus. Matthew, for instance, emphasizes that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Now, this doesn't mean that this theme about Jesus isn't seen in the other Gospels. It just means that Matthew really brings this out. Luke brings out the humanity of Jesus. John brings out the deity of Jesus. And when you come to the Gospel of Mark, the servantness of Jesus, you could say, Jesus as a servant, the servant of the Lord, really is brought out and emphasized. Now, if you approach the Gospel this way and you understand that, you see that the central verse that seems to tie the whole gospel together and bring a unity to the whole gospel is found in our passage today. These very famous, very powerful words from Jesus in verse 45, chapter 10, verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus speaks these words not in a vacuum, but in a context. He's in a conversation with his disciples, and the situation and the topics have led to Jesus saying this, and it's important for us to see that today. So we're going to look at verses 32 down through 45, and we're going to break up the passage into three headings: straight to Jerusalem, up to honor, and then down to service. Straight to Jerusalem, up to honor, and then down to service. And just to kind of give us this overall flow of thought here, what we see is Jesus is on the road with his disciples following him, and they're going straight to Jerusalem. Jesus pauses and he tells them again about what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. He's describing his humble commitment to submit to death in Jerusalem. He's not going there for glory. He's going there for humility and shame. He's in service to God, which means he has to go to Jerusalem. He has to submit to his enemies and give himself over to death. So his humble submission and service requires him going to Jerusalem. Well, on the way, the disciples, James and John, they have their minds totally in left field. They're not tracking with Jesus at all, and they come seeking glory for themselves. While Jesus is talking about his own death and talking about his own humility, talking about going down into shame, these guys have their own glory, their own honor in mind, and they ask him for seats of honor in the coming kingdom. You almost have to ask yourself how Jesus may have felt in that moment. Like, did it even register with you guys what I just said is happening right now and what we're going to Jerusalem? But he does. So their thoughts are up into their own glory, while Jesus' thoughts are down low into his suffering that he's about to step into. And then Jesus brings them down from seeking honor and glory for themselves, and he gives them this command, gives them these teachings about needing to see themselves as last, not first, being the least, not the greatest, being the servant and slave of all, not being the master of all. There's a different kind of ethic in the church when it comes to leading than there is, as Jesus points out, in contrast to those in the Gentile world and the way they lead. And Jesus finishes it all up by grounding his expectation of their humble willingness to suffer and to be servants in his own example of being a humble servant who's willing to step into suffering as he carries out his obedience to God. So always the example of Jesus is the grounding for our experience and our expectations of living the Christian life. And so it was so incongruous between Jesus's mentality in that moment and his experience that he was stepping into, and that of the disciples who had suffering and servanthood so completely out of mind. So we're going to go through this passage. That's kind of the quick little flow through of what's going on there, but we're going to break it up, as I said, into three sections: the straight to Jerusalem, the up to honor, and then the down to service. And we're going to pull this passage apart and see what Jesus has for us today. Let's get started.